The ballroom at Lady Rothwell's London townhouse blazed with enough candlelight to make the entire assembly appear gilded, as if wealth and privilege could somehow be rendered visible through sheer luminosity. And Lady Victoria Ashworth stood near the refreshment tables with a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, watching the dancers spin past in their elaborate choreography while maintaining the carefully constructed expression of pleasant interest that had become her default public face over the past year. The mask she wore to conceal the fact that returning to London society after 12 months of self-imposed exile felt like volunteering to be slowly flayed alive in front of an audience that would pretend not to notice her suffering while cataloguing every detail for later gossip. She had rebuilt herself during that year away from town, had learned through painful and systematic effort to think about Duke Alexander Blackwood without her chest tightening to the point of breathlessness, had trained herself to hear his name in conversation without visibly flinching, had convinced herself and her family that she was ready to return, to resume her place in the social world that had witnessed her humiliation when Alexander ended their courtship with devastating abruptness, and no explanation beyond a brief note stating that circumstances had changed and he could no longer in good conscience continue pursuing a connection he had clearly valued less than she had foolishly believed. Her sister Charlotte stood beside her, providing the kind of supportive presence that required no words, simply existing as buffer between Victoria and the curious glances that had followed her since she entered the ballroom an hour earlier, the speculative looks that wondered whether the Earl of Pemberton's eldest daughter had recovered from whatever heartbreak had driven her from London last season, or whether she remained damaged goods, a woman who had been courted by a duke and then inexplicably dismissed, left to wonder what flaw or inadequacy had been discovered that made her unworthy of continuing his attentions. Victoria had grown accustomed to those looks during her brief weeks back in town, had learned to meet them with cool composure that suggested complete indifference to whatever conclusions people drew about her circumstances. But tonight, the attention felt heavier than usual, weighted with an anticipation she could not quite identify until Charlotte leaned close and whispered with unusual urgency, "Victoria, I think you should know that the Duke of Ravensworth has just arrived," her sister said quietly, using Alexander's formal title rather than his name, as if the extra syllable of distance might somehow soften the impact of information that made Victoria's carefully maintained composure crack just slightly, just enough that someone watching closely might have noticed the way her hand tightened around the champagne glass, or the brief moment when her breathing stopped entirely before forced herself to draw air and respond with the appearance of calm she had spent a year perfecting. "I see," Victoria managed, proud that her voice emerged steady, despite the chaos her sister's announcement had created in her thoughts and her body's involuntary responses. "Well, it is hardly surprising that he might attend Lady Rothwell's ball, given that she is his aunt, and he has presumably been invited to every significant social gathering this season as I have been. We are both adults capable of existing in the same room without creating a scene or causing embarrassment to our hosts. I have no intention of speaking to him or acknowledging his presence beyond what basic courtesy requires if we happen to be formally introduced, and I suspect he feels similarly about the awkwardness of encountering the woman he discarded so thoroughly a year ago." But even as she spoke these words of cool indifference, Victoria found her eyes searching the crowd for the tall figure she would have recognized anywhere, despite 12 months of determined forgetting. And when she finally spotted Alexander near the entrance where he stood greeting Lady Rothwell with the easy charm that had first attracted Victoria's attention 2 years earlier at a similar gathering, she felt something twist painfully in her chest. Some combination of anger and longing and the terrible recognition that a year had not been nearly long enough to erase the impact he had made on her heart and her life during the 6 months they had spent in what she had believed was genuine courtship leading inevitably toward marriage, and a shared future. He looked exactly as she remembered. Dark hair that never quite stayed in the fashionable style his valet attempted. Grey eyes that had once looked at her with warmth she had thought was love, but which had apparently been something far more temporary and conditional. The kind of aristocratic handsomeness that made other women stare and whisper and scheme for ways to attract his attention, now that Victoria had so spectacularly failed to retain it. And beside him, laughing at something Lady Rothwell had said, stood the Duchess of Westfield, recently widowed and possessed of the kind of sophisticated beauty that made Victoria feel suddenly provincial and plain, despite the expensive gown Charlotte had helped her select, and the careful attention her maid had devoted to arranging her hair in the latest fashion. The Duchess wore black silk that should have been mourning, but which somehow managed to look more seductive than sombre, and she had her hand on Alexander's arm with the casual, proprietary touch of someone who had every right to claim such intimacy, who expected such claim to be recognized and respected by everyone observing their entrance together. He brought her, Charlotte said unnecessarily, her voice tight with anger on Victoria's behalf. He brought the Duchess of Westfield to a ball where he knew you would be present, where he must have understood that seeing him with another woman would cause you pain regardless of how thoroughly you claim to have moved past last year's disappointment. That is cruel, Victoria, deliberately cruel in ways I would not have expected, even from someone who ended a courtship so abruptly and with such inadequate explanation. Victoria watched Alexander and the Duchess move deeper into the ballroom, watched other guests part to let them pass, while maintaining the kind of interested observation that suggested people were already speculating about whether the Duke of Ravensworth had found his future Duchess in the wealthy and beautiful widow, who had returned to London society only 3 months after her elderly husband's death. "Perhaps he did not know I would be here," Victoria heard herself say, though she did not believe it, could not believe that Alexander would have failed to learn she had returned to town, or that he would attend his aunt's ball without inquiring about the guest list and understanding that their paths would inevitably cross. Or perhaps he simply does not care whether I am present or not, whether seeing him with the Duchess causes me any distress, because I am ancient history and he has moved forward with his life in ways that make our brief courtship seem irrelevant, except as a minor footnote in his romantic career. Before Charlotte could respond with whatever fierce defense she was clearly preparing, a familiar voice interrupted from Victoria's other side, and she turned to find Thomas Sinclair standing there with his pleasant, unremarkable face, arranged in an expression of genuine warmth that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks since Victoria had returned to London, and Thomas had begun paying her the kind of steady, reliable attention that her father approved and her friends encouraged, but which Victoria herself could not quite determine how to feel about, beyond vague gratitude that someone apparently found her worthy of courtship, despite her history of being discarded by someone far more prestigious. "Miss Ashworth," Thomas said with a slight bow, "I wonder if you might grant me the honour of the next dance. I believe a waltz is beginning, and I would very much enjoy the opportunity to speak with you about the book you recommended last week, which I have now read and found remarkably insightful regarding the questions we discussed about the nature of romantic attachment and whether such feeling can survive significant obstacles or whether it inevitably diminishes when faced with practical difficulties." Victoria accepted his offered arm with a smile that felt only slightly forced, grateful for the distraction from Alexander's presence and the Duchess's beauty and her own complicated reactions to seeing them together, and she allowed Thomas to lead her onto the dance floor where the waltz had indeed begun and where they could speak with relative privacy amid the swirl of other couples. Thomas was the second son of the Earl of Bainbridge, possessed of comfortable income, if not spectacular wealth, and he had been courting Victoria with patient determination for the past month, making clear through word and deed that he found her intelligent and interesting and worthy of serious consideration as a potential wife. that her history with Alexander did not diminish her value in his eyes or make him question whether she might be damaged goods unsuitable for respectable marriage. "You have read the entire volume already?" Victoria asked as they began to move in time to the music, Thomas's hand at her waist maintaining proper distance while still guiding her with competent ease through the steps. "I confess I am impressed by your dedication, as the book is not short, and the author's style can be somewhat dense for readers unaccustomed to philosophical inquiry into emotional matters. I found it engaging precisely because it demanded close attention," Thomas replied, his eyes on her face rather than looking around the ballroom, as so many partners did when dancing was more social obligation than genuine pleasure. "The author argues convincingly that romantic love requires not just initial attraction, but sustained effort and mutual commitment to overcome the inevitable challenges that arise when two people attempt to build a shared life from their separate histories and preferences. I thought of you when reading that section, Miss Ashworth, and I wondered whether you agreed with the premise that love is primarily a choice one makes repeatedly, rather than simply a feeling that either exists or does not exist, independent of conscious decision." Victoria considered the question as they turned and spun, aware that Thomas was asking about more than just abstract philosophy, that his inquiry carried personal weight, given his obvious interest in courting her seriously, and her own uncertainty about whether she could ever feel for him the kind of immediate, overwhelming attraction she had experienced with Alexander, the sensation of recognition and rightness that had characterized those early weeks of their courtship before everything collapsed for reasons she still did not understand. "I think perhaps it is both," she said slowly, thinking through her response even as she spoke. "Initial attraction may be involuntary, something we experience rather than choose. But what we do with that attraction, whether we nurture it or suppress it, whether we commit to the work of building something lasting, or simply enjoy the temporary pleasure and then move on when difficulties arise, that is absolutely choice, conscious decision that reveals character and values, and whether we possess the kind of steadiness required for genuine partnership." "Then you believe it is possible to choose to love someone even if the initial overwhelming attraction is absent?" Thomas asked, and Victoria heard in his voice both hope and vulnerability, the recognition that he understood perfectly well that whatever she felt for him lacked the intensity she had experienced with Alexander, that he was asking whether she might be willing to build something with him based on compatibility and respect and shared values, rather than waiting for lightning to strike a second time. Before Victoria could formulate a response that was both honest and kind, that acknowledged his question without committing to an answer she was not ready to give, she became aware of a change in the atmosphere of the ballroom, a subtle shift in energy that made her look up from Thomas's earnest face to find Alexander standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching her with such focused intensity that she nearly stumbled in the waltz, her feet forgetting the steps they had known since childhood, because all her concentration had suddenly redirected toward the man who had shattered her heart a year ago and who was looking at her now as if he had been searching for her across vast distances and unexpected obstacles. Their eyes met and held for what felt like minutes, though it could only have been seconds, and in that brief connection Victoria saw something flash across Alexander's face. Pain, perhaps, or possibly regret, some emotion strong enough to break through his customary aristocratic reserve and reveal itself to anyone watching carefully enough to notice. Then the Duchess of Westfield appeared at his side, her hand slipping possessively through his arm, and the moment shattered, Alexander's expression smoothing back into polite neutrality, while the Duchess smiled with the kind of triumphant satisfaction that suggested she understood exactly what had just occurred, and considered it a victory in some competition Victoria had not realized she was participating in until it was already lost. Thomas had noticed the exchange, his grip on Victoria's waist tightening slightly, as if to anchor her, or perhaps to remind her of his presence and his steady reliability. And when he spoke, his voice carried unusual firmness. "You need not acknowledge him, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. "You need not grant him any portion of your attention, or your time, or your emotional energy, regardless of whatever claims he may believe his past connection to you creates. You are under no obligation to any man who treated you with such disrespect, and I hope you will remember that should he attempt to approach you this evening or seek private conversation that would only cause you additional pain." "Thank you," Victoria managed, grateful for Thomas's support, even as part of her mind insisted on cataloguing Alexander's appearance, noting details she had no business observing. The way his evening clothes fit perfectly across his shoulders, the slight shadows under his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping, the tension in his jaw that indicated whatever ease he was attempting to project was entirely performance rather than genuine comfort. "I have no intention of speaking with him beyond whatever minimal courtesy basic manners require if we are formally introduced, which I hope to avoid through careful management of my positioning for the remainder of the evening. But the universe," Victoria would reflect later, seemed determined to frustrate her plans for careful avoidance, because when the waltz concluded and Thomas was returning her to Charlotte's side, Lady Rothwell materialized with Alexander and the Duchess in tow, her expression suggesting she either did not understand or did not care about the extreme awkwardness she was about to create by forcing these particular people into close proximity and polite interaction. "Victoria, my dear," Lady Rothwell said, with the cheerful obliviousness of someone who believed social discomfort could be overcome through sheer determination to pretend everything was perfectly pleasant. "I do not believe you have been properly introduced to my nephew Alexander since you returned to London, and I thought it would be appropriate to remedy that oversight given that you are both frequent guests at my gatherings and will inevitably encounter each other throughout the season." Victoria executed a curtsy with mechanical precision, while her mind screamed at the injustice of being forced to stand here making polite conversation with the man who had destroyed her and the woman who apparently planned to marry him, and she managed to murmur something conventionally appropriate about being pleased to make the Duke's acquaintance while meeting his eyes for the briefest possible moment before looking away, unable to sustain contact that felt like pressing on a bruise that had never properly healed. Alexander bowed with equal formality, but when he spoke, his voice carried a roughness that suggested genuine emotion rather than performed courtesy. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice after a year of silence sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine, despite her determination to remain completely unmoved by his presence. "I hope you have been well since we last saw each other. I understand you spent much of the past year in the country with your family, and I trust the change of scenery proved beneficial to your health and spirits." The banality of his words contrasted so sharply with the intensity in his eyes that Victoria felt anger flare hot and sudden in her chest, burning away the careful composure she had maintained throughout the— "I have been perfectly well, Your Grace," she replied with cool precision. "And yes, the country proved most restorative after certain disappointments of the previous season. I find that distance and time have remarkable healing properties when applied consistently and without interruption by reminders of past errors in judgment." She had the satisfaction of seeing Alexander flinch slightly at her words, at the clear implication that their ended courtship had been an error she regretted. But before he could respond, the Duchess of Westfield laughed with a musical quality that suggested she found this entire exchange delightfully entertaining. "How wonderfully direct you are, Miss Ashworth," the Duchess said, her tone managing to make directness sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. "I confess I have always admired women who speak their minds regardless of social consequences, though I myself find that a certain degree of subtlety serves one better in navigating the complexities of aristocratic society. But then, perhaps you were not raised with the same understanding of how these matters should be properly managed." The insult was delivered with such perfect courtesy that calling it out would have made Victoria seem oversensitive or combative, but the message was unmistakable. The Duchess considered Victoria provincial and unsophisticated, someone who lacked the refinement required to retain a duke's interest, or to understand the subtle games that women of higher status played when competing for aristocratic attention. Victoria felt her cheeks flush with humiliation and anger, but before she could formulate any response that would not make the situation worse, Thomas stepped forward with unusual assertiveness. "I believe Miss Ashworth's directness is one of her finest qualities," he said firmly, addressing the Duchess with the kind of polite defiance that made clear he would not stand by while someone insulted the woman he was courting. "She speaks honestly because she values truth over social performance, and I find that refreshing in a world where so many people say one thing while meaning another, where words are carefully calculated for effect rather than used to communicate genuine thoughts and feelings. Perhaps your own experiences have taught you different lessons, Your Grace, but I would suggest that Miss Ashworth's approach to social interaction reflects strength of character, rather than any deficiency in understanding proper conduct." The Duchess's smile had frozen into something harder and less amused, but before she could deliver whatever cutting response she was clearly formulating, Alexander intervened with quiet authority. "Mr. Sinclair is quite right," he said, his eyes on Victoria rather than on Thomas or the Duchess. "Miss Ashworth's honesty has always been one of her most admirable qualities, and I regret that circumstances prevented me from properly appreciating that trait when I had the privilege of knowing her better. If you will excuse us, I wonder if Miss Ashworth might grant me a few moments of private conversation on the terrace. There are matters I would like to discuss that are not appropriate for such a public setting." "No," Victoria said flatly, surprising herself with the force of her refusal, the absolute certainty that she would not grant him the private audience he was requesting, would not put herself in a position to hear whatever explanation or justification he had spent a year preparing for this moment. "I do not believe we have anything to discuss, and I see no benefit to either of us in attempting to revisit past connections that ended decisively and, I had believed, permanently. You have clearly moved forward with your life in ways that do not include me, and I am in the process of doing the same, and I think it best for everyone if we simply maintain polite distance when social circumstances force us into proximity, rather than attempting to achieve some kind of reconciliation or closure that neither of us actually need." She turned away before he could respond, Thomas immediately offering his arm, and Charlotte moving to her other side in a clear demonstration of familial support, and they walked away from Alexander and the Duchess with as much dignity as Victoria could manage, while her heart pounded and her hands shook, and she felt the weight of his stare like a physical presence between her shoulder blades. They had nearly reached the refreshment tables when Charlotte leaned close and whispered with unusual vehemence, "You did exactly right, Victoria. Whatever he wants to say, whatever explanation he thinks will make you forgive him for last year, you are under no obligation to hear it. He made his choice when he ended your courtship, and you are making yours now by refusing to grant him access to your time, or your attention, or your emotional energy." But despite Charlotte's fierce support and Thomas's obvious approval of her refusal to speak privately with Alexander, Victoria found that she could not stop wondering what he had wanted to say. What matters he believed required discussion after a year of absolute silence? What could possibly have motivated to approach her tonight, when he must have known she would be angry and hurt, and entirely uninterested in whatever justifications he had prepared for his? The questions followed her through the remainder of the and kept her awake long into the night after she returned home. And when morning came, she was no closer to answers than she had been when Alexander first made his request on the terrace of Lady Rothwell's ballroom. The package arrived the following afternoon, delivered by a footman wearing the Ravensworth livery and carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and Victoria's first instinct was to refuse it entirely, to send it back unopened with a message that she wanted nothing from the Duke, and would appreciate him respecting her clearly stated desire to maintain distance, rather than attempting to circumvent her refusal through gifts or letters or any other means of forcing connection she had explicitly rejected. But curiosity won over pride, and she found herself accepting the package and carrying it to her chamber, where she could open it in private, away from Charlotte's concerned observation and her father's likely disapproval of any continued contact with the man who had caused his daughter such visible pain. Inside the wrapping she found a book, a collection of Byron's poems, leather-bound and clearly expensive, the kind of gift that would be appropriate for close friends or family, but which carried additional weight given that poetry had been something she and Alexander had discussed frequently during their courtship, that she had once mentioned loving Byron's work, and he had apparently remembered that detail despite the year that had passed since they last spoke. Tucked inside the front cover was a note in Alexander's distinctive handwriting, and Victoria unfolded it with hands that trembled, despite her determination to remain completely unmoved by whatever he had written. Miss Ashworth, I realize you have no reason to accept anything, no obligation to read this note, or to consider the contents of this package as anything beyond unwelcome intrusion from someone whose presence in your life you have made clear you no longer desire. But I am asking anyway, begging really, for you to grant me the opportunity to explain what happened last year, to help you understand that my actions, however they appeared, and however much pain they caused you, were motivated by circumstances I could not control and concerns for your safety that made continuing our courtship impossible under the conditions that existed at that time. I know that sounds like excuse-making, like the kind of vague justification that means nothing and changes nothing about the fundamental fact that I hurt you deeply through my abrupt withdrawal and my failure to provide adequate explanation for my behavior. But I swear to you on everything I value that there were reasons, genuine reasons, that had nothing to do with any flaw or inadequacy on your part, and everything to do with dangers I could not expose you to without violating every principle I hold about protecting those I care about from threats they should never have to face because of my own complicated history and obligations. If you will grant me one conversation, 1 hour of your time, in whatever location and under whatever conditions you consider appropriate to ensure your comfort and safety, I will explain everything. I will answer every question you have about why I ended our courtship so suddenly, why I never contacted you during the year that followed, why I have only now returned to London, and why I appeared at Lady Rothwell's ball with the Duchess of Westfield, when I must have known that seeing us together would cause you additional pain. And after I have explained, after you understand the full scope of what occurred and why I made the choices I made, you will be free to make your own decision about whether my actions were justified or whether they represent unforgivable cowardice that no explanation can adequately excuse. Please, Victoria, grant me one conversation. That is all I ask. Alexander Victoria read the note 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and raising new questions about what dangers he was referring to. What threats could possibly have been serious enough to warrant ending their courtship without explanation? What had changed in the past year that made him suddenly willing to provide the clarification he had withheld for 12 months of her wondering and grieving and slowly rebuilding her life around his absence? Part of her wanted to burn the note and the book together, to refuse his request just as she had refused his attempt at private conversation at the ball, to maintain the firm boundaries she had established and not allow him any opportunity to work his way back into her thoughts and her heart, with explanations that might sound convincing, but which ultimately changed nothing about the fundamental fact that he had hurt her terribly, and she had no guarantee he would not do so again. But another part of her, the part that had never stopped loving him despite a year of determined effort to forget, the part that still woke sometimes in the night with tears on her face from dreams in which he explained everything and begged her forgiveness, and they rebuilt what had been broken between them. That part desperately wanted to hear what he had to say, to understand what had motivated his behavior, to learn whether there might be some explanation that would make sense of the senseless, and allow her to stop wondering whether she had somehow failed him, or disappointed him, or simply been insufficient to retain his interest. Once the initial excitement of courtship faded into the reality of considering permanent commitment, she was still staring at the note when Charlotte knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her sister's eyes immediately going to the book and the paper in Victoria's hands, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she recognized the Ravensworth crest on the wrapping that Victoria had carelessly left on her bed. "He sent you a gift," Charlotte said flatly, moving to examine the book with the kind of protective suspicion she had been directing toward anything related to Alexander since his reappearance last night. "And a note, apparently, given that you are reading something with an expression that suggests you are contemplating terrible ideas that will only cause you additional pain and heartbreak if you actually act on whatever he is proposing." "He wants to explain," Victoria said quietly, handing Charlotte the note so her sister could read Alexander's words directly rather than relying on Victoria's summary. "He says there were circumstances I did not know about, dangers he was protecting me from, reasons for his behavior that had nothing to do with any failure on my part, and everything to do with his own complicated situation. And he is asking for one conversation where he can tell me everything and then allow me to decide whether his explanation justifies what he did or whether it simply represents elaborate excuse-making designed to assuage his guilt at having treated me so badly." Charlotte read the note with an expression of growing skepticism, and when she looked up, her eyes were hard with an anger Victoria recognized as being directed entirely at Alexander, rather than at her sister's foolishness in considering his request. "This is manipulation," Charlotte said bluntly. "This is him using vague references to danger and protection to make you curious enough to grant him the audience you very properly refused last night, to override your better judgment by suggesting there is some dramatic explanation that will somehow make everything acceptable when the truth is probably far more mundane. He met someone else, or he got cold feet about marriage, or he simply decided you were not worth the effort required to actually build a lasting relationship. Men always have reasons for their bad behavior, Victoria, and those reasons always sound compelling when they are the ones explaining them. But that does not mean you are obligated to listen or to forgive, or to give him another opportunity to hurt you when he has already demonstrated his capacity for causing pain." "I know," Victoria said, because she did know, could recognize the truth in Charlotte's warnings, even as something in her insisted that she needed to hear what Alexander had to say, that she would never be able to fully move forward if she did not at least understand what had motivated his actions, even if that understanding did not lead to reconciliation or forgiveness. "I know you are probably right, that this is likely just him wanting to feel better about himself by offering an explanation that makes him seem less cruel or cowardly than he actually was. But Charlotte, what if there really is more to the story? What if there were circumstances I did not understand that genuinely complicated things in ways he could not share without creating additional problems? Do I not owe it to myself to at least hear what he has to say before I dismiss him entirely and commit to building a future with someone like Thomas, who is safe and reliable, but who will never make me feel the way Alexander did during those 6 months when I thought we were building something real and lasting?" Charlotte was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between her desire to protect Victoria from further heartbreak and her recognition that her sister would never be at peace if she did not at least hear Alexander's explanation, would always wonder whether she had made the right choice in refusing to listen, whether there might have been some justification that would have changed everything if only she had been brave enough to hear it. "If you decide to meet with him," Charlotte said finally, "you will do so in a public location with me present as chaperone, and you will not allow him to maneuver you into any private setting where he might use charm or physical presence to overwhelm your better judgment. And Victoria, she paused, taking her sister's hand with unusual intensity, whatever he tells you, whatever explanation he offers, please remember that explanations do not erase damage already done, that understanding his motivations does not obligate you to forgive him or to give him another chance to prove himself worthy of your trust. You are allowed to hear what he has to say and still decide that his behavior was unacceptable regardless of his reasons, that you deserve better than someone who would abandon you so completely, even if he believed he was protecting you from something dangerous. Victoria sent a note to Alexander that afternoon agreeing to meet him in Hyde Park the following morning at 10 o'clock, with Charlotte present as chaperone, and with the clear understanding that she was granting him 1 hour to explain himself and no more, that after that hour she would make her decision about whether his explanation warranted any further contact or whether this meeting would represent their final conversation. She also sent a note to Thomas informing him of her decision, feeling she owed him that courtesy given his obvious interest in courting her and his right to know that she was meeting with the man who had previously held her affections. And Thomas's response came within hours, brief but gracious, stating that he respected her need to understand what had happened and that his regard for her would not change regardless of what Alexander revealed or what decisions she made about her future. The night before the meeting, Victoria slept poorly, her dreams filled with confused images of Alexander and danger and choices that led to devastating consequences, no matter which option she selected. And she woke feeling exhausted and uncertain, tempted to cancel the entire meeting and simply continue building her life around Alexander's absence, rather than risking reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But she forced herself through the morning preparations, allowed her maid to dress her in a walking dress of deep green that Charlotte said brought out the colour in her eyes and made her look strong rather than vulnerable, and she was ready when the carriage arrived to convey her and Charlotte to Hyde Park for the meeting that might change everything or might simply confirm that some things, once broken, could never be adequately repaired, regardless of explanations or apologies or good intentions. Alexander was already waiting when they arrived, standing beside a bench near the Serpentine where the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold that made the scene feel almost dreamlike. And when he saw Victoria approaching, he straightened with visible tension, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides in a gesture of nervousness she had never observed in him during their courtship, when he had always seemed perfectly composed and in control of every situation. He bowed as she and Charlotte reached the bench, and when he straightened his eyes, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite her determination to remain completely unmoved by whatever he said or did during this hour she had granted him. "Miss Ashworth," he said formally, then seemed to reconsider and continued with her given name. "Victoria, thank you for agreeing to meet with me, despite having every reason to refuse. I know I have no right to your time or your attention, no claim on your consideration beyond what you choose to grant out of your own generous impulses, and I am profoundly grateful that you are willing to at least hear what I have to say before making your final decision about whether I am someone worth knowing or someone best forgotten and avoided for the remainder of your life." "You have 1 hour," Victoria replied, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart was pounding, the way her hands wanted to tremble if she did not deliberately steel them. 1 hour to explain what happened last year, why you ended our courtship so abruptly, why you never contacted me during the 12 months that followed, and why you have suddenly reappeared now as if we might simply resume where we left off, despite the year of silence and pain you subjected me to without explanation or justification. I suggest you use that hour wisely, because I will not grant you a second audience if this one proves unsatisfactory, or if your explanations strike me as insufficient to justify your behavior." Alexander nodded, accepting her terms without argument, and gestured toward the bench in invitation for her and Charlotte to sit while he remained standing, pacing slightly, as if movement helped him organize his thoughts or manage the obvious tension that radiated from his entire body. "The explanation begins with my father," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he was making no attempt to conceal. "The late Duke of Ravensworth died 2 years ago under circumstances that were officially ruled natural causes, a sudden heart failure that took him in his sleep, but which I never fully believed were as simple as the doctors claim. My father was a healthy man, active and energetic despite being in his 60s, and his death seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to benefit certain people who stood to gain from his passing, for me to accept without question that it was merely unfortunate timing rather than something more sinister." He paused, his jaw working as if the next words required physical effort to produce, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight of barely suppressed fury. "My father's financial advisor was a man named Richard Thornley, the uncle of the current Duchess of Westfield, and he had managed the Ravensworth estates and investments for nearly 15 years before my father's death. After I inherited and began reviewing the estate books in detail, I discovered significant irregularities, funds that had been moved between accounts without clear justification, investments that had failed spectacularly despite my father's usual cautious approach to financial matters, expenses that seemed inflated or entirely fabricated when I investigated them more thoroughly. The more I looked, the more evidence I found that Thornley had been systematically defrauding my father for years, siphoning money from the estate for his own use, and covering his tracks through elaborate accounting manipulations that my father apparently never discovered or perhaps discovered too late to prevent. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand where this explanation was heading, why Alexander might have felt compelled to end their courtship if he believed his investigation of Thornley's crimes might somehow threaten her safety or implicate her in dangerous circumstances. "You think Thornley killed your father?" she asked quietly, horror and sympathy temporarily overwhelming her anger at Alexander's past behavior. "You think he murdered the Duke to prevent being discovered and prosecuted for fraud?" "I do not have proof," Alexander said, his hands clenching into fists. "Not the kind of proof that would convince a magistrate or hold up in court. But yes, I believe Thornley somehow arranged my father's death to look like natural causes, when it was actually murder designed to eliminate the one person most likely to discover his embezzlement and take action to recover the stolen funds and see him prosecuted for his crimes. And once I began investigating seriously, once I started asking questions and reviewing records and consulting with financial experts about the irregularities I had discovered, strange things started happening. My carriage was tampered with in ways that could have caused a serious accident. Documents I had been examining went missing from my study. I received anonymous notes warning me to stop looking into matters that did not concern me or face consequences, similar to what had happened to my father. He stopped pacing and turned to face Victoria directly, his expression raw with remembered fear and present regret. "That was when I ended our courtship," he said quietly. "Not because I had stopped caring about you, or because I had found someone else, or because you were somehow insufficient or disappointing, but because I realized that being connected to me made you a target, that Thornley might use you to threaten me or to force me to abandon my investigation, that I could not, in good conscience, continue courting you while I was involved in something so dangerous that it might get both of us killed if Thornley decided eliminating me was necessary to protect himself. So I wrote you that terrible note and I sent you away without explanation. And I spent the next year trying to gather enough evidence to have Thornley arrested and prosecuted, while living in constant fear that he might somehow discover you mattered to me despite our ended connection, and use that knowledge to hurt you as a means of hurting me." The silence that followed this explanation seemed to stretch and thicken until it felt almost tangible, and Victoria sat frozen on the bench, trying to process everything Alexander had just revealed. trying to reconcile this dramatic story of murder and fraud and danger with the simple hurt she had felt when he ended their courtship, trying to determine whether she believed him or whether this was elaborate fiction designed to excuse inexcusable behavior through appeals to protection and safety. That might sound noble, but which ultimately represented his choice to make decisions for her without her knowledge or consent. "You should have told me," she said finally, her voice shaking with anger and hurt and confused relief that his abandonment had not been because she was unworthy, but because he had believed himself to be protecting her. "You should have explained what was happening and allowed me to make my own decision about whether I was willing to accept the risk of being connected to you during your investigation, rather than simply cutting me off without explanation and leaving me to spend a year believing I had somehow failed you or disappointed you or been insufficient to retain your interest." "I know," Alexander said, and the remorse in his voice sounded genuine rather than performed. "I know I should have trusted you enough to share what I was facing, should have given you the information you needed to make informed choices about your own safety and your own life, rather than making those decisions for you as if you were a child who needed protection from difficult truths. But Victoria, I was terrified, genuinely, desperately terrified, that anything connecting you to me might make you a target, that Thornley might hurt you to punish me for investigating his crimes, or to force me to abandon my pursuit of justice for my father's death. And I convinced myself that the kindest thing I could do, the most protective action I could take, was to cut all ties between us so thoroughly that no one would believe you mattered to me anymore, so that even if Thornley discovered we had once been courting, he would understand that connection had ended and that threatening you would accomplish nothing." "That was not your decision to make," Victoria said, standing abruptly because sitting felt like accepting his explanation too easily, and felt like conceding that his protective impulse justified his behavior when she was not ready to grant such a concession. "That was not your choice to make for me. You do not get to decide unilaterally that I am too fragile or too precious or too vulnerable to accept risk, that I need to be shielded from danger even if that shielding requires lying to me through a mission and abandoning me without explanation and leaving me to suffer through a year of not understanding what I had done wrong or how I had failed to be what you needed. If you had truly respected me, if you had genuinely valued me as a partner rather than as something to be protected like delicate porcelain, you would have told me the truth and trusted me to make my own informed decision about whether I wanted to continue our connection despite the danger." Charlotte had risen as well, her hand on Victoria's arm providing silent support, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same anger Victoria felt burning in her own chest. "My sister is absolutely right. Your explanation may account for your behavior, may provide context that makes your actions more understandable, but it does not excuse them or make them acceptable. You treated Victoria as if she were incapable of assessing risk or making difficult choices, as if she needed you to decide what was best for her, rather than trusting her to be a full participant in determining the shape of her own life. That is not protection, that is control, however benevolently motivated, and it reveals assumptions about women and their capacity for independent thought that I find deeply troubling, regardless of how noble you believe your intentions were." Alexander had paled during this speech, and when he responded, his voice carried a humility Victoria had never heard from him before. "You are both absolutely correct," he said quietly. "I see that now, though I confess it has taken me most of the past year to understand how profoundly I failed Victoria by making choices for her rather than with her, by prioritizing my own fear and my own need to protect over her right to know what was happening and to participate in decisions that affected her life as much as mine. I have no defense for my behavior beyond the inadequate explanation that I was operating out of terror rather than reason, that I allowed fear to override every other consideration, including basic respect for Victoria's autonomy and intelligence, And I understand if that explanation is insufficient, if my recognition of my failures comes too late to repair the damage I caused, or to rebuild what I destroyed through my cowardice and my arrogance in believing I knew better than she did what would keep her safe. Victoria studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or performance, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse and recognition of wrong done, and she felt some of her anger beginning to soften into something more complicated, something that acknowledged his failures, while also recognizing that he had been trying, however incompetently, to protect her from genuine danger rather than simply discarding her because she no longer interested. "Where is Thornley now?" she asked. "Because if this entire story was true, then surely the investigation must have reached some conclusion, must have resulted in arrest or prosecution or some resolution that had prompted Alexander's return to London and his apparent willingness to resume the social life he had abandoned during his year of gathering evidence." "He was arrested 3 weeks ago," Alexander said, visible relief crossing his features at this shift in conversation toward practical matters, rather than continued examination of his failures. "I finally gathered enough evidence, bank records showing systematic theft, testimony from other victims he had defrauded, correspondence suggesting his involvement in my father's death, to convince the authorities to act, and he is currently awaiting trial for fraud, embezzlement, and suspected murder, though that last charge may be difficult to prove, given how carefully he covered his tracks. But the point is that he no longer represents a threat, that his ability to harm anyone connected to me has been eliminated, and that I am finally free to return to London and to attempt to rebuild connections I destroyed during my investigation, without the fear that such rebuilding might endanger the people I care about." "So you ended our courtship to protect me from Thornley," Victoria said slowly, working through the implications. "And you have returned now because Thornley has been arrested and no longer poses danger, and you apparently believe that this explanation will somehow make everything acceptable, that I will simply forgive the year of pain and confusion and allow us to resume where we left off, as if nothing had happened to change the fundamental dynamic between us. Is that an accurate summary of your expectations, Your Grace? Because if so, I am afraid you have fundamentally misunderstood both the situation and my character." Alexander shook his head quickly, his expression almost desperate. "No, that is not my expectation at all, or rather, it should not be, though I confess some part of me hoped that explaining might somehow make you more willing to consider giving me another chance to prove myself worthy of your trust and your regard. But I understand that explanation alone changes nothing, that I have damaged your trust in me so severely that simply accounting for my behavior does not repair that damage or obligate you to risk being hurt again by someone who has already demonstrated his capacity for causing pain, even when his intentions were protective rather than deliberately cruel. What I am asking for, Victoria, what I am hoping you might consider granting me, is the opportunity to rebuild your trust through actions rather than words, through sustained demonstration that I have learned from my mistakes and that I am capable of treating you with the respect and honesty and genuine partnership you deserve, rather than making unilateral decisions about your life and your safety, as if you were incapable of making such decisions for yourself." Victoria looked at Charlotte, seeking her sister's opinion, and Charlotte returned her gaze with an expression that clearly communicated skepticism mixed with recognition that this decision was ultimately Victoria's to make, that no one could decide for her whether Alexander's explanation was sufficient or whether his request for a second chance deserved consideration. "I need time," Victoria said finally, turning back to Alexander. "I need time to think about everything you have told me, to process the information, and to determine whether I believe your explanation justifies your behavior, or whether it simply provides context that makes your actions more understandable without making them acceptable. And I need to decide whether I am willing to risk trusting you again when you have already proven that you will make major decisions about our relationship without consulting me, if you believe such decisions serve what you perceive to be my best interests. That is not a decision I can make standing here in Hyde Park an hour after learning the truth about what happened last year. Of course, Alexander said quickly, obvious relief in his voice at not being rejected outright. Take whatever time you need, Victoria. I will not pressure you or attempt to force a decision before you are ready to make one. I will simply make myself available should you wish to speak further, should you have additional questions about what happened or about my intentions going forward, and I will respect whatever conclusion you ultimately reach about whether I am someone worth knowing or someone best left in your past, where I can cause no further harm. They parted then, Victoria and Charlotte returning to their carriage, while Alexander remained by the Serpentine watching them depart, and throughout the journey home, Victoria remained silent, her mind churning through everything Alexander had revealed and trying to determine what she felt beyond the immediate confusion of anger and sympathy and residual love, all tangled together in ways that defied easy sorting or clear resolution. It was only when they reached home and were safely in Victoria's chamber away from servants and family that Charlotte finally spoke, her voice carrying unusual gentleness. "What are you thinking?" Charlotte asked, settling onto Victoria's bed while her sister paced the room with the restless energy of someone whose thoughts would not permit stillness. "Do you believe him? Do you believe that his story about Thornley and fraud and danger was genuine rather than elaborate fiction designed to excuse inexcusable behavior?" "I think I believe," Victoria said slowly, testing the words even as she spoke them. "Not because I particularly want to believe him, or because his explanation makes me feel better about what happened, but because the details ring true in ways that would be difficult to fabricate, and because I cannot imagine him constructing such an elaborate story unless it were fundamentally accurate, even if some specifics might be exaggerated or shaped to present his actions in the most favorable possible light. But Charlotte, even if I believe his explanation, even if I accept that he was genuinely trying to protect me rather than simply discarding me because I no longer interested him, I am not sure that changes anything about the fundamental problem that he made major decisions about our relationship without consulting me, without trusting me enough to share what was happening and allow me to participate in determining how we should respond to the danger he perceived. "Ow!" Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting she understood exactly the dilemma Victoria was articulating. "So the question is not whether his explanation is true, but whether truth makes his behavior acceptable, whether understanding his motivations obligates you to forgive him and give him another chance to prove he can be the partner you deserve, rather than someone who will make unilateral decisions whenever he believes such decisions serve your best interests. And I think only you can answer that question, Victoria, because it requires determining what you need from a partner and whether you believe Alexander is capable of providing it, or whether his protective instincts will always override his respect for your autonomy whenever he perceives conflict between the two." "I do not know," Victoria admitted, sinking into the chair by her window and staring out at the London street below without really seeing the passing traffic or the pedestrians going about their business. "I do not know whether people can change fundamental aspects of their character, whether Alexander can learn to treat me as a genuine partner rather than as someone who needs protection and management, whether I can trust him not to repeat this pattern whenever circumstances become difficult or dangerous. And I do not know whether I should even try to find out, whether I should give him the opportunity to demonstrate change, or whether I should protect myself by choosing someone like Thomas, who may not make me feel the intensity of emotion that Alexander evokes, but who also will not subject me to the devastating pain of being abandoned without explanation when he decides he knows better than I do what is best for my safety and my life." The answer to Victoria's questions began to emerge over the following week through actions rather than words, through Alexander's systematic demonstration that he understood what he had done wrong and was committed to rebuilding trust through sustained effort, rather than simply expecting forgiveness based on explanation alone. He called at the Pemberton townhouse the day after their meeting in Hyde Park, bringing with him documents that corroborated his story about Thornley, bank records showing the embezzlement, correspondence between Alexander and the authorities investigating the case, even testimonials from other families Thornley had defrauded over the years, all of it adding up to overwhelming evidence that Alexander's explanation had been truthful rather than fabricated. Victoria's father examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had managed estates and investments for decades, and after an hour of review, he looked up at Alexander with an expression that combined respect with residual suspicion. "Your story appears to be accurate, the Earl said carefully, "and I can understand why you might have felt compelled to end your courtship with Victoria if you believed that continuing the connection would endanger her safety. However, I must tell you that I find your failure to consult either Victoria or myself about the situation deeply troubling, regardless of your protective motivations. My daughter is not a child who requires shielding from difficult truths, and I resent the implication that you believed yourself better qualified to determine what was best for her than she was to determine that for herself with full knowledge of the circumstances." "I understand your concern, my lord," Alexander replied, with the humility that had characterized all his interactions since his explanation in Hyde Park, "and I agree completely that my behavior was unacceptable, regardless of my intentions. I made a serious error in judgment by prioritizing my own fear over Victoria's right to know what was happening and to participate in decisions that affected her life as much as mine. All I can do now is acknowledge that error and commit to behaving differently in the future should Victoria choose to give me the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change rather than simply professing intentions that may or may not translate into actual improvement in how I treat her." The Earl had studied Alexander for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge fault rather than defending your actions as justified by circumstances. That suggests a degree of self-awareness and capacity for growth that makes me marginally more willing to consider allowing you to resume courting Victoria, though I want to be clear that such permission is contingent on her own desires and will be immediately revoked if I perceive that you are repeating patterns of making decisions for her rather than with her. My daughter has already suffered enough because of your protective instincts. I will not allow her to be subjected to additional pain if you prove incapable of learning from your mistakes." After that initial meeting with her father, Alexander had begun a careful campaign to demonstrate change through action, appearing at social events where Victoria was present but never forcing interaction, always waiting for her to indicate willingness to speak before approaching, never pressuring her for decisions or commitments or any indication of whether she was considering giving him another chance. He sent notes apologizing for specific aspects of his behavior rather than offering general expressions of regret, showing that he understood in detail what he had done wrong, the failure to trust her with difficult information, the arrogance of believing he knew better than she did what would keep her safe, the cruelty of leaving her to wonder for a year whether she had somehow been inadequate or disappointing. Each note was brief and specific and required no response, making clear that he was not seeking absolution, but rather attempting to communicate understanding of the harm he had caused. And then, 2 weeks after their meeting in Hyde Park, Alexander sent a note that was different from the others, one that proposed something more substantial than apology or explanation. He was leaving London, the note explained, returning to Ravensworth Manor for an extended period to attend to estate business that had been neglected during his year of investigating Thornley's crimes, and he wanted to invite Victoria and her family to visit for a fortnight if they were willing to make the journey. The purpose of the invitation, he wrote, was to allow Victoria to see him in his proper context, not as the London aristocrat performing social roles, but as the man who managed estates and cared for tenants, and took seriously the responsibilities that came with his title and his position. He wanted her to judge him based on how he lived when not performing for society, to observe how he treated people who depended on him for their livelihoods and their welfare, to determine whether the man she might potentially commit to spending her life with was someone of genuine character, or merely someone skilled at presenting attractive appearances while hiding less admirable truths beneath polished surfaces. Victoria had read this invitation multiple times, recognizing it as both generous offer and calculated strategy. Alexander, understanding that she needed to see evidence of change rather than simply hearing promises of improvement, that she would be more willing to trust him if she could observe him over an extended period in circumstances that revealed his actual character rather than his carefully constructed public persona. And the invitation was risky for him as well. If she observed his management of Ravensworth and found it lacking, if she discovered that he treated his tenants poorly, or managed his estates carelessly, or revealed in any way that his apparent character was performance rather than reality, she would have definitive evidence that he was not someone worth trusting or building a future with. The fact that he was willing to take that risk, to open himself to her scrutiny in ways that might result in her permanent rejection, suggested either genuine confidence in his own character or desperate hope that seeing him in his proper context might somehow overcome her remaining doubts and objections. She discussed the invitation with Charlotte and with her father, both of whom expressed different forms of skepticism. Charlotte worried that Victoria would be swayed by Alexander's charm and the romantic setting of a country estate visit, while her father worried that accepting the invitation would send signals to Thomas Sinclair and to society more broadly that Victoria had decided to forgive Alexander and resume their courtship when she had not yet reached any such conclusion. But Victoria found herself wanting to accept, despite these reasonable concerns, wanting to see Alexander at Ravensworth and to judge for herself whether the man he presented in London matched the reality of how he lived when not performing for social audiences, wanting to understand whether his apparent humility and his recognition of wrong done represented genuine change or simply skilled performance designed to manipulate her into forgiving behavior that should not be forgiven. She wrote to Thomas before making her final decision, feeling she owed him that courtesy given his patient courtship and his obvious hope that she might eventually choose him over Alexander, that she might decide safety and reliability were more valuable than the intensity of emotion that Alexander evoked, but which came packaged with the risk of devastating pain if he proved incapable of change. Thomas's response was everything she might have expected from someone of his character, gracious and understanding, expressing hope that the visit would provide her with clarity about her feelings and her future, reaffirming his regard for her regardless of what decisions she made about her and his invitation. Reading his note, Victoria felt a pang of guilt that she could not simply choose Thomas, could not make the rational decision to build a life with someone who would never abandon her, or make unilateral decisions about her safety, or subject her to the kind of pain Alexander had caused. But her heart apparently did not operate according to rational principle, and she found that she could not commit to Thomas while still wondering whether Alexander might somehow prove worthy of the second chance. He was requesting through action rather than words. So she accepted Alexander's invitation, and 3 days later, she found herself in a carriage with Charlotte and her father, travelling north toward Yorkshire and Ravensworth Manor, toward a fortnight that would either confirm her decision to forgive Alexander and attempt to rebuild what had been broken between them, or would provide definitive evidence that his patterns of behaviour were too deeply ingrained to change and that she needed to protect herself by choosing someone whose love came, without the complications and dangers that apparently characterized any relationship with the Duke of Ravensworth. Ravensworth Manor rose from the Yorkshire countryside like something from a painting, all golden stone and mullioned windows, and the kind of architectural grace that suggested generations of careful stewardship and genuine care for beauty as well as function. And as their carriage rolled up the drive, Victoria found herself admitting that Alexander had been right about one thing. Seeing him here, in this context, already felt different from encountering him in London ballrooms, where performance was expected and genuine character could be hidden beneath layers of social convention and aristocratic polish. The estate grounds were immaculately maintained without being oppressively formal, gardens giving way to parkland that suggested both aesthetic consideration and practical management, and the tenant cottages they had passed on their approach had all appeared well kept and prosperous, suggesting that Alexander took seriously his obligations to the people who depended on him for their livelihood. Alexander was waiting on the front steps when their carriage arrived, and he greeted them with the same careful courtesy that had characterized all his interactions since his explanation in Hyde Park. Welcome that was warm without being presumptuous, attention that was focused without being overwhelming, demonstrating through every gesture and word that he understood. This visit was an opportunity for Victoria to assess him rather than a guaranteed reconciliation or a foregone conclusion. He showed them to their rooms, Victoria and Charlotte sharing a suite in the family wing, while the Earl had been given chambers that suggested honoured guest rather than someone relegated to lesser accommodations, and then suggested they might rest from their journey and reconvene for dinner that evening, when he would introduce them to his steward and his housekeeper, and some of the neighbours who helped him manage various aspects of estate business. The fortnight that followed was unlike anything Victoria had experienced during their previous courtship in London. A sustained period of observation during which she saw Alexander in contexts that revealed character rather than performance, interacting with people who depended on him and who therefore had every incentive to be honest about whether he treated them well or poorly, whether he kept his promises or made commitments he failed to honour, whether he was genuinely the man he presented himself to be, or whether that presentation was careful construction that concealed less admirable truths. She watched him spend hours with his steward, reviewing accounts and discussing improvements to tenant housing, saw him walk the estate with his land agent, examining crops and livestock, and making decisions about resource allocation that balance profit with sustainability and care for the land itself, observed him settle disputes between tenants with fairness that suggested he listened to all parties before reaching conclusions, rather than simply imposing his will because he possessed the authority to do so. She attended a dinner where Alexander's neighbours spoke openly about how he had handled the discovery of Thornley's fraud, how he had worked to recover funds, not just for his own estate, but for other families Thornley had defrauded, how he had spent months gathering evidence and coordinating with authorities, rather than simply accepting the loss and moving on, because pursuing justice was too difficult or too time-consuming. She heard stories about Alexander helping tenants through difficult circumstances, providing support during illness or family crisis, remembering birthdays and anniversaries, and all the small details that suggested he paid attention to people as individuals rather than simply as sources of labour or rental income. And she saw him with children from the estate, watching him interact with genuine warmth and interest rather than the distant courtesy aristocrats often employed when forced to acknowledge the existence of young people who were not their own offspring or immediate relations. Throughout all of this, Alexander made no attempt to pressure Victoria for decisions or to manufacture private moments that might allow him to plead his case, or to use charm or physical presence to override her careful judgment. And this restraint was perhaps more persuasive than any amount of direct courtship could have been, because it demonstrated respect for her process and her need to reach conclusions at her own pace, rather than according to his timeline or his desires. He included her in the estate business when she expressed interest, explaining his reasoning for various decisions, and sometimes actively soliciting her opinion on matters where he genuinely valued outside perspective, treating her as an intelligent partner rather than decorative companion who needed to be shielded from practical concerns or difficult choices. And gradually, as the days passed and Victoria accumulated observations and experiences that revealed Alexander's character in ways London ballrooms never could, she found her remaining doubts and reservations beginning to dissolve, found herself understanding that whatever mistakes he had made a year ago, he had learned from them, had genuinely grasped what he had done wrong, and was committed to behaving differently going forward. She saw evidence that he valued honesty and partnership, that he consulted with people rather than making unilateral decisions whenever consultation was possible, that he took seriously his obligations to people who depended on him, and that those obligations extended beyond merely providing material support to actually caring about their welfare and their lives in ways that could not be faked or performed for her benefit during a 2-week visit. On the final evening of the fortnight, Alexander requested a private audience with Victoria in the estate's library, and when she arrived, with Charlotte positioned in the adjoining room as chaperone in accordance with propriety, though far enough away to provide the privacy genuine conversation required, she found him standing by the window, looking out over the grounds with an expression of such vulnerability that it made her chest tighten with sympathy and residual love, and the recognition that, whatever else he might be, he was genuinely frightened of her rejection, genuinely uncertain whether she would choose to give him the second chance he had spent 2 weeks attempting to earn through demonstration rather than mere words. "Victoria," he said, turning when he heard her enter, and the use of her given name without title or formal address communicated the intimacy he hoped they might reclaim if she would permit it. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me privately, and thank you for these past 2 weeks of allowing me to show you who I truly am rather than who I appeared to be in London when performance was expected, and genuine character could be hidden beneath social convention. I know you came here to judge whether I am someone worth trusting, whether the mistakes I made a year ago represent permanent flaws in my character, or whether I am capable of learning and changing and becoming someone who can be the partner you deserve, rather than someone who will make unilateral decisions whenever circumstances become difficult." He moved closer, but stopped several feet away, maintaining physical distance that suggested respect for her boundaries and her autonomy. "I love you, Victoria," he continued, his voice rough with emotion he was making no attempt to conceal or control. "I have loved you since the early weeks of our courtship 2 years ago, and I never stopped loving you during the year we were apart, and I will continue loving you regardless of what decision you make about whether I am someone worth building a future with or someone best left in your... But I am asking, begging, really, for you to give me another chance, to allow me to court you properly this time with honesty and partnership and genuine respect for your autonomy and your right to make informed decisions about your own life. I cannot promise I will never make mistakes or that I will always know the right thing to do in complicated situations, but I can promise that I will never again make major decisions about our relationship without consulting, that I will trust you enough to share difficult information and allow you to participate in determining how we respond to whatever challenges we might face." Victoria studied his face, searching for signs of performance or manipulation, but found only what appeared to be genuine emotion and real vulnerability. Alexander, laying himself bare in ways aristocratic men were taught never to do, risking rejection that would leave him devastated in pursuit of reconciliation that was not guaranteed, simply because he had spent 2 weeks demonstrating improvement. "I love you too," she heard herself say, the admission emerging before caution could prevent it, before she could second-guess whether acknowledging her feelings would somehow give him power over her or leave her exposed to future hurt if he proved incapable of maintaining the growth he had demonstrated during these 2 weeks. "I have loved you through the entire year we were apart, even when I was furious with you and convinced I should hate you for what you did. And I have loved you during these past weeks of watching you manage your estates and interact with your tenants and demonstrate that the character I glimpsed during our courtship was genuine rather than carefully constructed performance. She took a step closer, closing some of the distance between them, though not all of it, not yet. But Alexander, I need you to understand that loving you does not mean I am willing to accept being treated as someone who needs protection rather than partnership. Does not mean I will tolerate you making decisions for me whenever you believe such decisions serve my best interests as you perceive them. If we are going to build something together, it has to be as equals who trust each other enough to share difficult information and work through challenges together, rather than one of us trying to shield the other from complexity or danger or any of the other realities that will inevitably arise during a life shared between two people. I understand, Alexander said quickly, his expression transforming with obvious relief at her acknowledgement that she loved him and was at least considering the possibility of reconciliation. And I agree completely with your conditions. I want partnership, Victoria. Genuine partnership where we make decisions together and where I trust you enough to share what is happening rather than trying to manage everything myself because I believe I know better than you what will keep you safe. That is what I should have done a year ago, and it is what I commit to doing going forward if you will give me the chance to prove that commitment through sustained action rather than just words spoken in a moment when I am desperate to convince you I have changed. Victoria closed the remaining distance between them, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, feeling the slight roughness of stubble against her palm, and the warmth of his skin, and the way he leaned into her touch as if starving for connection after a year of self-imposed isolation. I am going to give you that chance, she said quietly, because I believe you have learned from your mistakes, and because I love you too much to walk away without at least trying to build something real and lasting together, now that we both understand what went wrong the first time. But Alexander, understand that I am taking an enormous risk by trusting you again, after you demonstrated so thoroughly your capacity for causing pain, even when your intentions were protective. If you fail me again, if you revert to making unilateral decisions or hiding information because you believe such hiding serves my best interests, I will not give you a third chance. This is it, your one opportunity to prove you can be the partner I need, rather than the protector you apparently believed I required. I will not fail you, Alexander promised, pulling her into his arms with the kind of careful strength that communicated both desire and restraint, holding her close, but not too close, demonstrating through physical touch the same respect for boundaries he had maintained throughout her visit to Ravensworth. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what I did wrong, and that I am capable of being the husband you deserve, the partner who trusts you and respects you and values your judgment and your autonomy as much as I value my own. I love you, Victoria, and I will show you through daily action what that love means. Not protection that strips you of agency, but genuine partnership that recognizes you as my equal in every way that matters. He pulled back slightly, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his mother, he explained, jewelry that had been waiting for the woman he would marry since his mother's death when Alexander was still a child. Will you marry me? He asked, his voice shaking slightly despite the obvious effort to maintain composure. Will you take the risk of building a life with me despite everything I have done wrong, despite the year of pain I caused through my arrogance and my failure to trust you with difficult truths? I know I am asking for extraordinary grace and forgiveness, but I am asking anyway, because I cannot imagine a future without you, cannot conceive of building a life that does not include you as my wife and my partner, and the person I turn to first in times of joy and in times of crisis. Yes, Victoria said, the word emerging with absolute certainty despite all the rational reasons she might have refused, despite Charlotte's warnings and her father's concerns and her own well-founded fears. that Alexander might revert to old patterns whenever circumstances became difficult. Yes, I will marry you, Alexander Blackwood, because I love you, and because I believe you have genuinely changed, and because I am brave enough to risk my heart again, when the alternative is spending my life wondering whether I gave up too soon on something that might have been extraordinary. If only I had been willing to extend the grace and forgiveness you are requesting. I will marry you, and we will build something real together, something based on honesty and partnership and mutual respect, rather than on one of us trying to protect the other from the realities of living in a complicated world where danger and difficulty sometimes arise regardless of our best efforts to prevent them. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and then he kissed her with the kind of restrained passion that suggested he was holding himself back out of respect for propriety and Charlotte's nearby presence. And Victoria kissed him back with all the love and forgiveness and hope she had been storing up during 2 weeks of careful observation and assessment. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily and both clearly struggling to maintain appropriate decorum, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that would remain imprinted on Victoria's memory for all the years that followed. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for your grace and your forgiveness, and your willingness to give me a second chance I did not deserve, but which you granted anyway, because you possess the kind of generous spirit I should have recognized and valued a year ago, rather than treating you as someone who needed shielding rather than partnership. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your trust, Victoria, and I will never again make you doubt your worth or your value or your right to full knowledge of everything that affects our shared life. You are my partner, my equal, my choice above all others, and I will demonstrate that through actions sustained over years and decades, rather than simply professing intentions that may or may not translate into actual improvement. I am holding you to that promise," Victoria replied, smiling despite the tears that tracked down her cheeks, happy tears rather than sorrowful ones, tears of relief that they had found their way back to each other despite the obstacles and the pain and the year of separation that had nearly destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. "I am holding you to that promise every single day for the rest of our lives, and if you ever forget, or if you ever start reverting to old patterns of making decisions without consulting me, I will remind you swiftly and firmly that we are partners, equal, people who trust each other enough to face whatever challenges arise together, rather than one of us trying to shoulder everything alone out of misguided protective instincts." They returned to the drawing room together to share their news with Charlotte and Victoria's father, both of whom reacted with mixed emotions, happiness for Victoria's obvious joy tempered with residual concern that Alexander might prove incapable of maintaining the growth he had demonstrated during the past 2 weeks, that he might revert to old patterns once the immediate pressure to prove himself had passed, and Victoria's forgiveness had been secured. But Victoria was confident in her decision, certain that Alexander had learned his lessons thoroughly enough that he would not repeat mistakes that had nearly cost him everything that mattered. And as they celebrated the engagement with champagne and toasts and plans for a wedding that would occur once they returned to London, she felt a peace settle over her that she had not experienced since Alexander first ended their courtship a year earlier, a sense that she had made the right choice even if it was also a risky choice, that sometimes the greatest rewards required the greatest courage to pursue, despite legitimate fears about potential costs. They married 3 months later in London, Victoria wearing her mother's wedding dress that had been carefully preserved and which fit her perfectly after minor alterations, and as she walked down the aisle toward where Alexander waited with such obvious love and commitment and recognition of how fortunate he was to have been granted a second chance he had not deserved, but which Victoria's generous spirit had offered anyway, she thought about the year of pain they had both endured, about the mistakes Alexander had made, and the grace she had extended, about the way trust could be rebuilt through sustained demonstration rather than mere words, and she understood that their marriage would be stronger for having weathered such crisis before they even reached the altar, that they had already learned lessons about partnership and communication and respecting each other's autonomy that many couples never learned until after years of marriage had revealed such lessons to be necessary. And when Alexander spoke his vows, when he promised to love and honor and cherish her, to be faithful and true in prosperity and adversity, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as they both should live, Victoria heard in his voice not just conventional words spoken because liturgy required them, but genuine commitment to the partnership they had agreed to build together, to the equal relationship that recognized both their needs and their rights and their capacity to face whatever challenges might arise through mutual support, rather than one of them trying to shield the other from difficulty. She spoke her own vows with the same conviction, promising to trust and to challenge and to stand beside him through whatever their life together might bring. And when they sealed their promises with a kiss that drew appreciative applause from the assembled guests, she felt certain that they had built a foundation strong enough to support whatever structure they chose to create together, that their love had been tested and refined by separation and had emerged stronger for having survived such trial.